Australia, the United States and Japan are all preparing for war against China. And everyone understands that Taiwan could be a trigger for that war. China says that Taiwan is and always has been part of China. The Taiwan separation from China is unfinished business from the Chinese Civil War that started in 1946. And that while it would prefer peaceful reunification, it is prepared to use force if necessary to regain Taiwan. The rise of nationalist and anti-reunification politics in Taiwan, especially since the 1990s, has alarmed Beijing, and they have been increasingly aggressive militarily and in their response politically to any new manifestation of Taiwan separatism, or any support for it from Western politicians, most notoriously the infamous visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan in 2022. She was the Speaker of the US House of Representatives. For their part, American governments have long made it clear that they would go to war to prevent a Chinese takeover. Here's what Elbridge Colby, Donald Trump's Under-Secretary for Defence Policy, had to say just a few years ago. If China could establish hegemony over the Asia-Pacific region, then it will be able to challenge US global interests. Because of this, the US defence strategy should prepare for military conflict with China over Taiwan. So it's very fundamental to American imperialism. Australian governments have long made their position clear. As Richard Marles put it, Australia could not be, quote, a passive bystander in the event of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And of course then the new Japanese Prime Minister said that a Chinese takeover of Taiwan would be an existential crisis for Japan. So the first thing I think we need to say to situate the talk is that any war between China and the West triggered by Taiwan will not primarily be a war over Taiwan. It'll be a war waged by a West that is increasingly desperate to contain China's economic growth and growing military power, and a war waged by China to break free from the West's attempts to squeeze its modernisation and further growth of influence and power. It would be an imperialist war over present and future domination of the world. Now, the only progressive solution to such a nightmare is both to fight against these preparations for war, and in particular the preparations of our own ruling class for war. Now, there will be a Taiwanese dimension to such a war, and arguments about Taiwan already dominate the ruling class's propaganda for war. The lies and distortions of the ruling class to get the population to accept wars that they want to wage are just as important as the submarines and fighter jets, because without the population, it's very hard to wage war, at least the toleration. So to fight the push for war, we need to be able to challenge these lies. So the aim of this talk is really to start the process of helping us to understand Taiwan and the Taiwan question. And so most of the talk is actually going to be, much of it will be historical, but obviously there'll be some on current Taiwanese politics. So firstly I want to deal with the question, is Taiwan part of China? Now, one of the things that most intrigued me when I started work on this was that the idea of Taiwan belonging to China really only becomes relevant in 1943. Taiwan, then known by its Portuguese name of Formosa, had been grabbed by the Japanese Empire in 1895. In 1931, Japan began its invasion of mainland China. Now, when the US went to war against Japan from 1941, they wanted the Chinese army to fight the Japanese invader to assist America's own war effort. Chiang Kai-shek was then the president of the Republic of China, and his strategy was to avoid confronting the Japanese as much as possible so as to focus on smashing the insurgent communists led by Mao Zedong, because of the threat they posed to the capitalists in the cities and the landlords across the countryside, who were, of course, the basis of Chiang Kai-shek's regime. So in November 1943, the US and Britain held a conference in Cairo, and China as well, at which they promised that after victory, quote, all territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, such as Manchuria, Formosa and the Pescadores, shall be restored to the Republic of China. And that's what happened. Japan surrendered to the United States in August 1945, the Japanese handed control of Taiwan to Chiang Kai-shek. So the Americans and British are as much the authors of the idea that Taiwan is part of China as anyone else. However, the defeat of the Japanese was the beginning of the end for Chiang Kai-shek on the mainland. His Kuomintang government was corrupt, incompetent and brutal. Chiang Kai was really one of the most monstrous dictators of the 20th century, and there's a lot of competition for that. His son ran a massive secret police that routinely and openly assassinated critics, jailed and tortured and often executed protesters and strikers. I haven't got time to go on about one of my favourite topics. Chiang's civil war against the communists created one of the greatest hyperinflations in history. Forget the Weimar Republic. In a 12-year period, prices rose not by 152 times, not by 152,000 times, by 152 trillion times. In late 1948, prices were doubling every 2 days. Doubling every 2 days. Starvation and collapse were everywhere, while Chiang's extended family, of course, were making fortunes out of it. The People's Liberation Army faced only token resistance as they swept into Beijing and then marched south to take over the whole country. In early 1949, facing defeat, Chiang and his administration and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, between 1 and 2 million people, retreated to the island of Taiwan, which then had, I think, about 5.5 million people. Chiang's plan was to use the retreat to Taiwan to regroup his forces to reconquer the mainland in the future, no doubt thinking the communists were just this fly-by-night bunch of, peasant idiots. Despite ruling just a bunch of small islands, the government of the Republic of China insisted that it was the sole legitimate government of all of China. It kept all the apparatus of government for China as a whole. This fantasy was sustained by the United States and its Western allies, including Australia, of course. Chiang Kai-shek's government, ruling a few million people on Taiwan, had the China seat at the United Nations as the government representing all of China. That is until 1971, when the General Assembly of the United Nations voted, quote, "The representatives of the government of the People's Republic of China are the only lawful representatives of China." And they voted to, quote, "expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy at the United Nations and in all the organisations related to it." So from 1949 to 71, there were two governments claiming to be the only lawful government of the whole of China. Both governments, including the one, especially the one that's supported by the US and Australia, regarded Taiwan as part of China. How could they not? That's where they were based. Every Western government regarded Taiwan as part of China. No ifs, no buts. The reason this matters is that there is a constant ruling class offensive to deny that there is any historic link between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. That China's claim is purely aggression. Now, this is the same pattern we see in every war, where our bosses lie about the regime they're fighting. It's not so long ago that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was, of course, the new Hitler. It's disturbing then when elements of this ruling class campaign are recycled by some on the left. So, for instance, April Holcomb has written in Red Flag, quote, "Taiwan has never been, the claim that Taiwan is part of China is historically baseless." Right? This is just feeding and legitimising the ruling class campaign. Then on the Links website, Chris Lee from the Socialist Alliance in Melbourne has recycled another of the major ruling class claims, quote, "Taiwan has never been controlled by the CCP. But the latter claims it is part of China because it was once part of the Qing Empire." Now, this is an astonishing claim. Let's apply it to Vietnam. Did the fact that the Vietnamese Communist Party had never ruled South Vietnam meant their war to unite Vietnam in the 1970s and throw out the Americans was unjustified? And there's many other examples you can think of. We need to be clear here. I think a successful invasion of Taiwan by the People's Republic of China in the 1950s would have been a massive victory against American imperialism. That's not the case today. That is not the case today. China has become a great power. Nationalism is central to the ability of the CCP to maintain its legitimacy, and the idea of reuniting with Taiwan is central to that nationalism. It would no longer have anything to do with liberating the people of Taiwan or defeating breaking American imperialism in a progressive way. So we oppose the forcible incorporation of Taiwan into China, amongst other things also because it's absolutely clear the people of Taiwan do not want it. We should also be clear that national borders have time and time again been redrawn after wars, with whole populations finding themselves now the citizens of a different country with a different national language, different educational, political system, and so on. Almost every war to supposedly undo these previous injustices has been a reactionary war, whose real purpose was to strengthen one state and its capitalists at the expense of another. Now, these are the basis, I think, on which we oppose China's military action to reunite Taiwan. Okay, so now I want to discuss the issue of, is there a national question in Taiwan? What is the nature of the Taiwanese state? When the Communist Party won control of China in 1949, the US government had their absolute fill of Chiang Kai-shek and his brutal and corrupt government. In early 1950, they expected the People's Republic to invade and conquer Taiwan, and they planned to abandon Chiang Kai-shek. That changed like on a dime, to use the American phrase, in June 1950 when the Korean War started. The United States decided that it needed Taiwan as a military and surveillance base. US President Harry Truman ordered the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to prevent any invasion. Ships from the US 7th Fleet would continue to patrol the strait for the next 30 years, defending Chiang Kai-shek's regime. Taiwan became an essential link in the chain of US military power in the region, playing a major role in the American surveillance of China and the American war against Vietnam. Economic aid poured into Taiwan, saving its economy from collapse. Military aid helped Chiang Kai-shek rebuild and modernise his demoralised army. Now, there were some important confrontations between the People's Republic and Taiwan in 1954 and in 1958. And they focused around a series of islands that are not part of, they're separate from the main Taiwanese island. One of the things that most people mistakenly think is Taiwan is this island, about 60% the size of Tasmania. Taiwan consists of 168 islands. That's the regime. A chunk of those islands are just here, like literally in the harbour of one of China's major cities, Xiamen. I've just flown through Xiamen, transited through Xiamen, flying back from China. If you walk around the perimeter on the footpath around the perimeter of Xiamen Island, you can literally see through the fog Taiwan. The closest Taiwan island is 3 kilometres. Then there's another major island which is 5 or 6 kilometres away, population of 120,000, I think, university, airport, and so on. And these islands, the Taiwanese government poured military, 50,000 soldiers into Kinmen Island. The People's Republic started shelling them, and there was a major crisis. There's another set of islands just opposite the Fujian capital of Fuzhou, the Matsu Islands, again, very close to the mainland, controlled by Taiwan. And these islands, actually the fate of these islands was an issue in the 1960 American presidential debates between Nixon and John F. Kennedy. That's how important they are. So when China was shelling these islands as part of this confrontation, the Americans threatened to attack the mainland, openly threatened to attack the mainland with nuclear weapons. So, with the Cold War in full swing, Chiang Kai-shek's regime survived, but only on the basis of this American protection. And that remains the case today. So, this means that Taiwan is what I would call an American protectorate. It's an American protectorate, an important asset for the American military in Asia, and that fundamentally shapes our attitude to Taiwan and its future. Nevertheless, a lot's changed since the 1950s. For one thing, in 1979, the US decided to normalise relations with China. The price China demanded for normalisation was that the US recognised, actually they demanded the US agree with their claim to Taiwan. The US went halfway. It agreed to declare that there was only one China, that's the official American policy, and said that the future of Taiwan's status was a matter for the two regimes on opposite sides of the Taiwan Strait, as long as they did it peacefully. It closed its embassy in Taiwan, closed down Taiwan's embassy in the US, pulled out all its troops and closed down its bases on Taiwan. So Taiwan at that point was no longer an actual American base. The broader ruling class in America was alarmed, and Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which is still a major part of US policy, that said that not only would the US continue to have normal economic and cultural relations with Taiwan, it would also sell Taiwan weapons sufficiently powerful for it to defend itself. And this is the policy that is now known, and you read it in the papers, as strategic ambiguity. The second important development in the years after 79 was the incredible economic development of China, to the point where everyone agrees it's at least the second largest economy in the world. I think it's the largest. And this has allowed China to build a massive military, and that has again increasingly alarmed the American ruling class. And so both of these factors have led to increasingly aggressive behaviour on the Taiwan question and across the Taiwan Strait. A massive increase in the presence of American, Australian and other Western warships, air forces in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. A number of collisions and near collisions between fighter aircraft, warships and so on. Any one of these incidents could spiral into an uncontrolled armed conflict. So the third important development since 79 has been the rise of Taiwanese nationalism, and I'll deal with that just a bit later on. So in response to all of this, sections of the left have started talking about, quote, the right of the Taiwanese people to national self-determination. Ellie Friedman and Kevin Lin are two writers based in America who I deeply respect and have done important work on the working class movement in China, and who also attack the imperialism of both China and the US. But in a recent book they co-wrote with a couple of other authors, they described Taiwan as one of the, quote, nations and peoples oppressed by the Chinese state because of the Chinese military stuff, along with Xinjiang, Tibet and Hong Kong. Now this is frankly nonsense. Taiwan is not an oppressed nation. It's ruled by Taiwanese politicians, the economy is run by Taiwanese capitalists, and the politicians are elected by the Taiwanese people. While the threat of military action from China imposes some limits on their ability to participate in global capitalist system, the UN, make agreements with other capitalist states, military agreements, these restrictions are not fundamental to their ability to run a successful modern capitalist economy and military. What's more, Taiwanese capitalists have been invited into China to exploit Chinese workers and make extraordinary profits. Taiwan remains an important element of American military power in the region. This is how former Prime Minister Scott Morrison described Taiwan's importance to American imperialism. Quote, if Taiwan were to fall, the Indo-Pacific strategic geometry would shift overnight. The first island chain, which contains Chinese military might, would be broken, pushing US forces back to the second island chain and weakening their ability to provide an effective regional counterbalance. Taiwan is today's West Berlin. Now, the reason I brought the map is I want people to really understand the argument about the first island chain, because you are going to hear more and more about it. So the first island chain, which is a kind of a barrier around China, starts with the main Japanese islands, and then a string of Japanese islands that run all the way down to here. So the most southerly Japanese island is 100 kilometres east of Taiwan, right? There's the main Japan, there's Taiwan, that's still Japan. And then there's a range of islands, the Philippine Islands, Malaysia, and so on. The most important of these Japanese islands, these are all peoples regard themselves as, oppressed and don't want to be part of Japan, is Okinawa, which is here. Okinawa has 32 separate American military bases on a very small island, including the biggest American base in the world. Okay, just to pick up. So that's the first island chain. And Taiwan is here. Taiwan is kind of like the arch in the doorway, whatever. Okay. So it's telling to me that Taiwan's historic role as an American base, an American asset in East Asia, is nowhere to be found in Ellie Friedman and Kevin Lin's book. When people start talking about defending Taiwan's so-called independence, many often end up attacking America for being an unreliable supporter of Taiwan, as if what's needed is a reliable American guarantee. One of the most important publications of the New Left in Taiwan is called New Bloom. Last year, its editor, Brian Huey, complained about Elbridge Colby from the Trump regime, appearing to advocate, in his mind, his fevered mind, US isolationism, charging that Colby, quote, appears to be someone else who is looking for excuses to drop US support of Taiwan. Sometimes this is hinged on the argument that Taiwan does not do enough for its own defence. Never mind that Taiwan faces an existential threat. So I think you cannot find a clearer statement that Taiwan could not exist without the protection of the US military, and that the US should more firmly commit itself to a potential war with China to maintain the so-called independence of the Taiwanese state. This is a betrayal of all who directly and immediately suffer from the daily operations of the global American empire. How can you demand US support for Taiwan and at the same time support the people of Okinawa who have fought against those bases and American military presence for over 80 years? In another article, he complained, Colby's aims are to maintain US hegemony without scarcely any thought for states aligned with the US in the Asia Pacific. So this is the logic of Taiwanese nationalism today. There is another side to Taiwan's status as an American protectorate. It gives the US, not China, an effective veto over major elements of Taiwan's military and foreign policy. In the 1950s, when the US sent the Seventh Fleet to protect Taiwan from invasion, it was also tasked with preventing any Taiwanese attack on the People's Republic because the US did not want a war with China at the time. And then when Taiwan started developing its own nuclear weapons program from the late 1960s, the US forced them to shut it down. Okay, so now I want to turn to the question of Taiwanese nationalism. Many on the left argue that the emergence of a specifically Taiwanese nationalism shows there is a distinct nation, not only separate from China, but rejecting any claim that Taiwanese people are Chinese. And this is used to bolster the argument that China's no legitimate claim to Taiwan. Now, there's some significant truth here, but we need to be careful. There is nothing to celebrate in Taiwanese nationalism, which in all its forms is a reactionary ideology today. But it was also one grounded originally in a very real oppression. First, some background. When the Americans handed Taiwan over to Chiang Kai-shek, it had two significant populations. The first was an Aboriginal population that arrived around 10 or 15,000 years ago, Austronesian peoples speaking a range of languages and related to Polynesian islanders in the Pacific and the Maori of Aotearoa. The second group were the descendants of labourers from the neighbouring Fujian province who were recruited in the 1600s by Dutch colonists to work growing rice, sugar and so on. Most of the people from Fujian, including today incidentally, spoke a variant of the Hokkien language, others a variety of the Hakka language. These languages are completely different from modern Chinese national language, Chinese, Mandarin. Okay, I'm going to have to chop a bit of this. After the US surrendered Taiwan, after the Japanese surrendered to America in 1945 and Chiang Kai-shek came in, he launched an extraordinary wave of repression, a massacre against protesters, martial law, totalitarianism, which is today known as the White Terror. His insistence that the Kuomintang were the legitimate government of China led to extreme cultural repression on Taiwan. Chinese Mandarin was made the only acceptable legal language. And this was a completely alien language to the population of Taiwan. History was Chinese history and so on. Positions of power, positions in government went overwhelmingly to mainlanders who had become as part of the retreat. And so this created, if you like, an ethnic divide in Taiwanese society. And once the US opened up to China and China opened up to the US, the regime faced a crisis. It had to reform. So it started to liberalise, it started to Taiwanese-ise, if you want to use that phrase, opening up jobs to the earlier Taiwanese residents. And over a period of time, the regime allowed the development of a rival political party, which was based in a sense in a form of Taiwanese nationalism, argued that was the Democratic Progressive Party, which is now has the government, the president rather. And this led to an explosion in Taiwanese culture after the repression of the Chiang regime, which also developed a nativist racial wing that sees Taiwanese people as a race separate from Chinese due to their intermingling with the indigenous peoples. And DPP in government, with first one government in the year 2000, adopted a systematic de-Sinicization policy, which alarmed Beijing. Okay, so what I think, I'm going to have to chop a fair bit of this section, but what I think... That's all right, I did it the other day, Beirut. So what this led to is a serious polarisation of politics on Taiwan over this kind of rival nationalism, rejection of Chineseness, and so on. And one of the most extraordinary things is that it actually gave the disgusting, corrupt Kuomintang party a new lease of life. And they now, with a partner party, control the parliament. So the politics is divided between a president from the DPP and a parliament from the Taiwanese People Party and the Kuomintang. The other impact it had, which I think is more important from our point of view, is that it divided the trade union movement and the working class. Right, so there is no single, ACTU kind of labour leadership. It's allowed bosses to dominate the worker organisations of their employees. And the end result of this division, this ethnic division and political nationalism division in Taiwan, is that Taiwanese workers earn far less than workers in other countries with comparable GDPs per capita. One survey in 2025 found that 60% of workers had not received a single pay rise in 3 years. 12% had gone for a decade without a pay rise, which tells you how weak the unions are, and this is one of the major factors. The other thing that's just briefly mentioned is Taiwanese attitudes to reunification. It's absolutely true that only a minority would be comfortable with reunification. But what's most remarkable is the vast majority want the status quo to continue. They don't want a government that provokes China, and every time the DPP has gone a bit too far in that direction, it's lost votes and lost power. They also don't want reunification. They want the status quo. It's like 90-something%. That's some variant of the status quo is what they want. The problem they face is this is the least likely future that they face. Okay, so now I just want to briefly sum up. The ordinary workers and socialists of Taiwan and indigenous people too are in a terrible position. On the front line of the world's most dangerous imperial rivalry, and living in an American asset that is claimed by China as part of its historic nation, with the South China Sea more and more and the Taiwan Strait more and more militarised. We are committed to stopping any war that would potentially destroy their society. But we only do this on the basis that leads to a weakening and ending of the system of imperial rivalries. That means recognising that Taiwan is not an oppressed nation, nothing progressive about Taiwanese nationalism. It is reactionary in the global context and within Taiwan society. And we do this because it is essential to standing up to the propaganda and lies of our own regime. Our task is to stop the drive to war here. The challenge facing workers, socialists, Indigenous people in Taiwan is to begin this task of exposing the real nature of the state in which they live and the corrupting effects and destructive effects of the competing Taiwanese nationalisms under which they live, and to fight them in order to build unity, not only within the Taiwanese working class, but ultimately with the wider working class in China. That's the only real solution to the barbarism they face.